So as you described, these were not reciprocal tariffs, and many observers have commented on how bizarre the method of calculation was. Could you explain what appears to have happened?
Sure. I mean, some of it is unclear. It's based on media reporting, but what it seems like happened was for several weeks, the Trump administration, so Trump gave himself a self-imposed deadline of April 2nd for what he called reciprocal tariffs and what the administrator promoted to be reciprocal tariffs. But as this deadline approached, many reports emerged about how the White House was engaged in debate over how to actually implement these reciprocal tariffs that he had announced in advance and essentially committed himself to. To not announce them would have made Trump lose all credibility in international negotiations, even with the tariffs he already imposed on Canada and Mexico. So the result appears to be a compromise between those who wanted high universal tariffs to address trade deficits, like Senior Counselor to the President for Trade and Manufacturing, Peter Navarro, and Commerce Secretary Lutnick, and another camp inside the White House, those who wanted actual reciprocal tariffs to renegotiate trade barriers, like Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent and U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer. So many people who remember the first Trump administration recall that Navarro represents a more hardline perspective, and he views trade deficits as fundamentally bad, all of them, and tariffs as fundamentally good, or at least he believes that they will protect the U.S. manufacturing sector and boost exports with the added benefit of raising revenues. It's like a article of faith for him. Now, on the other hand, Bessent, I think he's more realistic. He sees tariffs from a more strategic perspective as a way to build leverage for negotiations or even to restructure the economic system in America's interest. So the universal camp of Navarro and his allies, you could say they had a plan that was more simple and easy to calculate. High universal tariffs, and then, based on the trade deficit, adding something extra. While the reciprocal camp had a more country-specific idea that would put leverage for bilateral negotiations, but also be a more justifiable principle, reciprocity, to sell to the American people, because it depicts the U.S. as responding rather than acting. So according to the reports, these two camps were competing for Trump's attention in crafting trade policy. And apparently, USTR took the effort to actually calculate a more sophisticated method of levying reciprocal tariffs based on countries and sectors. But Trump chose not to use this method at the last minute. Instead, the compromise was a universal tariff of 10% and additional country-specific tariffs on top of that for trading partners with significant trade surpluses to the U.S. It is these additional tariff rates that were revealed to simply be the U.S. trade deficit with the country divided by exports divided by 2, which is wild. Trump said that he actually said that he divided it by 2 to be kind to U.S. trade partners. So, not to get too specific, but the trade deficit was actually divided by exports multiplied by 2 parameters. One was the elasticity of import demand, meaning the estimate of how responsive U.S. buyers of imports would be to changes in prices. The other was the price pass-through of the tariffs, meaning an estimate of how much the price increase from a tariff increase would be expected to be passed on to the American consumer or businesses. But it really doesn't matter because the way they set these 2 parameters, you multiply them together, it creates 1. So the denominator of that equation ends up just being exports. Now, it goes without saying, this is a very, very strange method. It means that countries with low average tariffs on the U.S. got hit because of their large surpluses with the U.S., which may not be a function of it. While those who actually have deficits with the U.S., where the U.S. is exporting, has a trade surplus, like Singapore, they nevertheless got hit with the universal 10% rate. So underlying this method is the implication that Trump thinks that the U.S. should have completely balanced trade or even a trade surplus with every nation on earth, including small countries and poor countries. And since this makes no sense, I just have to conclude that this is another Trump negotiating tactic, building leverage bilaterally for eventual future deals. And there's other questions. For instance, what are the real tariff rates that U.S. partners have imposed on U.S. goods? When you look it up, these bear no relation to the Trump administration's figures. Trump's tariff chart makes it clear that USTR also included currency manipulation and non-tariff trade barriers in their figure. So it's not exactly the real tariff rate. But these barriers, they see unfair subsidies, labor suppression, perhaps even intellectual property theft. But it's not clear how even these factors are related to the USTR's tariff rate, which is not calculated by attempting to quantify the impact of these factors on US trade deficits. So they use this language, but it doesn't seem to have any reflection in the real actual tariff rate they decided. So that leads to another question, which is, how will these tariffs actually address the US trade deficit? In reality, the tariff rates of trading partners are not directly correlated to the size of the US trade deficit with that country. In other words, even if tariff rates are lowered, this would not in all cases reduce the deficit, simply because there are few analogs to the US market. Obviously, there are many other factors that lead to trade imbalances, like the composition of a trading partner's economy, the size of its market, per capita GDP. But perhaps the only real analog to the US market is the EU, but almost no other market on earth is comparable to the US. So to be charitable to Trump's advisors, I think they're conceptually correct in recognizing that tariffs are not the only source of trade imbalances. Although their calculation doesn't make sense from a logical standpoint, the fact they included currency manipulation and non-tariff barriers in their rationale implies that the new tariffs are in response to a broader class of policies that are not compatible with free trade theory. Trade deficits being used to estimate the imbalance between US trade policy and that of its trading partners is a very imprecise way to do it, and it's also unfair in its own right. So again, I think this can only be understood as a simple way of doing a complex thing. The solution the administration settled on is far from ideal, but the best I can say is that it is a solution with a certain internal logic, as haphazard and as imprecise as it turned out to be in practice. But bottom line, in any case, it's very misleading to call it a reciprocal tariff.
関税がもしアメリカがですねワークしていると世論が受け取ってしまうと、我々としてはやはりその見栄養のもというか、やはりグローバルな自由貿易良かったなということになりかねないというかですね、